Welcome to Yoga Hype in History. Today, we're really going to look at how modern postural yoga got to be what we see it as today in strip malls everywhere. And in fact, in honor of that, I'm wearing my t-shirt that says Secret Stash. There is actually a pizza place in Crested Butte, a little place in Colorado, that has a Himalayan themed pizza place that has all of this like mantras and whatnot all over the place. And they have these t-shirts that I quite like. And it's in this pseudo Devanagari, the language of Sanskrit. All right, so let's start the screen and get going today. All right. So we're really going to be talking about what is this thing called Mysore yoga. And we're going to be talking about a guy named Krishnamacharya, who's the guy who pretty much invented Mysore yoga. Why do I call it Mysore yoga? Well, Mysore is a city in South India, in Karnataka, and all these people were affiliated with Mysore. And in fact, Krishnamacharya was there for about 25, 30 years and was hugely influential in the style of yoga that he created then became a really big deal for yoga as we see it today. So who are the four figures we're going to be talking about? Well, first we have Krishnamacharya, who lived from 1888 to 1989. Yes, that is 101 years. He founded a school, maybe even a tradition of yoga that is called Ashtanga yoga, which in turn influenced every other figure and style within modern postural yoga. Arguably, Krishnamacharya, who we can see up here, is the father of modern postural yoga. He began joining postures together, which led to what we see these days in Vinyasa Ashtanga yoga that was set forth further by his disciple Pattabhi Jois, who's right down here. And I'll talk about those words in just a second. Now, Pattabhi Jois lived from 1915 to 2009. He was a student of Krishnamacharya, and in the 20th century, he became the lineage holder, sort of the main guru of Krishnamacharya's schools and traditions. He developed the use of postures in sequences in order to promote exercise. Also, he was a Brahmin. All of these characters are Brahmins from the priestly caste of Sanskritic culture. Now, notably, some scandals have come to light about Pattabhi Jois, and he would adjust females. So he would move their bodies into proper positions, more appropriately, like you can see him doing here in this little picture. And at that time, he would also touch women inappropriately. So supposedly, Pattabhi Jois was taught the full system of Krishnamacharya's yoga as based on a text called the Yoga Korunta. We'll talk about that text again in a second. Also, we have BKS Iyengar, Mr. Beat, Kick, and Slap. From 1918 to 2014, he lived. He was also the brother-in-law of Krishnamacharya. He wrote the book Light on Yoga, which became the yoga book in the 20th century. Everybody has a copy of this thing. Krishnamacharya was his teacher for a short period of time, and Iyengar says that Krishnamacharya was his yoga guru, but they really didn't study together very long, and they had somewhat of a cantankerous relationship. So Krishnamacharya sent BKS Iyengar north to a town called Pune, which is in Maharashtra, so near Bombay, near Mumbai. Okay, in Pune, Iyengar thrived and became an international figure, and people from all over the world went to his ashram there to learn yoga. Now, this book, Light on Yoga, provided the first how-to book of yoga that had extensive photo documentation. And finally, someone I'm not going to talk about as much is TKV Deshi Kachar, who lived from 1938. He's the guy up on the right to 2016. He was the son of Krishnamacharya, and he expanded his father's teachings to really talk about yoga for health. And he started a yoga clinic that's still going strong in Madras today. So what is Ashtanga and what is Vinyasa? When people say, what is the tradition of Krishnamacharya and Pattabhi Jois, they'll often call it Ashtanga Vinyasa. Well, Ashtanga, as we've seen before, means 8 limbs, referring to the 8 limbs of yoga. Of course, they really only do one limb, and that's asana, and maybe a little bit of pranayama, but they don't do any of the other limbs of yoga. So Krishnamacharya really kind of founded this style of doing yoga, but it only became widespread with Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois. So what Ashtanga Vinyasa does, it takes some traditional yoga poses, it takes Western physical culture ideas about exercise, and then it sort of strings them together. So they made up new body positions, new postures, new asanas based on experimentation. And over time, Pattabhi Jois actually took these sequences and codified them and said, okay, you do them this way every time, all the time. So Ashtanga Vinyasa, in brief, is a sequence of postures performed all together in yoga courses, in yoga classes. This is the beginning of group practice in a yoga class like we see to this day. Before this time, all of the yoga that was being performed would have been held for long periods of time to support meditation. They would not have been done with postures done in a quick sequence, and you wouldn't see people jumping between them. So you can see one set of forms here at the top. You can see all of the elaborate forms of of 3 different stages of yoga practices, some which are pretty darn complicated. Okay, so who is this Krishnamacharya? Well, his most important time for his career as a yoga teacher was when he was teaching in Mysore from the 1930s to the 1950s. Now, here he was really well supported by a local ruler by name of the Maharaja of Wodeyar IV. Was a very interesting character. So Krishnamacharya became an internationally known figure, but his intention was to develop yoga in India and for Indians. He had no intention of this being an international thing. He had no intention of having Western disciples, but Joyce and Iyengar and Desi Kachar, they actually had predominantly Western disciples. So, according to Krishnamacharya and his family, he was born in Karnataka to a Brahmin family, and they were big devotees of Vishnu. They were actually orthodox practitioners of what's called Vishishtadvaita, which is a type of Advaita Vedanta that aims to see that once Maya has been pierced, everything is the body of everything is God, and they aspire not to be liberated, but to be in a heaven state where they partake in the joy of God. All right, so the family was likely pretty poor, and Krishnamacharya describes working on plantations and having little food or clothing. His first good-paying job, in fact, that he ever had was when he was employed by the Maharaja of Wodeyar, and I'll talk more about this in a second. Now, he went to study Sanskrit as a young man in Benares, which is where you go to study Sanskrit. It's where I've gone to study Sanskrit. And he set out to learn, to study the darshanas, the yogic philosophies, and he became an expert in what's called Mimamsa. You may remember Mimamsa is the study of philosophy through Vedic scriptures. So he set out to learn yoga at the same time, and he found a guru named Ram Mohan Brahmachari, whom he said was the only person alive capable of teaching the full meaning of the Yoga Sutras. And after 7 years of practice in Tibet, why do they always go to Tibet? He learned all the asanas, and he was sent back to India to teach by his guru. We have no records of this guru ever existing. There is this perpetual argument that in the present day, no one is capable of teaching yoga, right? So we saw this throughout like the 19th century when people kept looking for this authentic yoga and they couldn't find anybody to teach it. I mean, likely he did meet somebody that taught him something, but we don't really know who this Ram Mohan Brahmachari was. So anyway, he returns from Tibet, and supposedly he's hanging out in Calcutta, and he finds this old manuscript of a text called the Yoga Karunta. And he found this, and it was written in Sanskrit in a Calcutta library. Now, no human being has ever seen the original, and he would supposedly say that he was teaching out of this text, but it's a lost text. There is no text. Folk today say that all the teachings of Ashtanga Vinyasa are found in the Yoga Karunta, but nobody has the Yoga Karunta. And while he may have published in his teachings some verses here or there, he never set out the book. I don't think the book actually ever existed. He also argued that Patanjali, the Patanjali Yoga Sutra was the root of his teachings. But you really don't see any yoga asanas in that text. We only have that one verse on asana, make it comfortable, make it firm, which does not look like anything that this guy does. So he actually later will argue that the Shatkarmani, which were those preparations like nasal lavage and passing cloth through the alimentary canal, that they were in fact not to be done in yoga because they weren't done in the Yoga Sutras. However, his gymnastic yoga in sequences is not found in Patanjali either. So he kind of takes it coming, he gets you coming and he gets you going. He says, oh, that's not yoga because it's not in the Yoga Sutras. But then when he's doing something that's not in the Yoga Sutras, he's like, oh, no, that's the essence of yoga. It's a common rhetorical move. So the thing was, he got married and he needed money. So he went to Mysore, and he originally was there to teach Sanskrit, but he also taught yoga. The yoga that he taught after a few years became a really big deal. And the Maharaja set him up at the palace, gave him like a yoga studio, effectively, as one wing of this beautiful palace. So this is from the 1930s and 40s, which is the same time that Joyce and Iyengar came down to Mysore and studied with him. So I have a picture, a young picture of the Maharaja of Wodeyar. He was a very interesting guy. He was interested in physical education, as I'll talk about. He was interested in advancing Indian culture and the culture of the area. He did this incredible thing where he installed electric lights in his palace. You see over here, and it is brilliant at night. It's one of the most bright things I've ever seen. I was trying to look for some pictures from when I was in Mysore, and I got some really great pictures of it being lit up. But it's not like they're just like floodlights. If you tour the castle or the fortress or the palace, you'll see that they're like little individual lights everywhere that cause the whole thing to light up. It's pretty darn cool. Anyway, so the Maharaja of Wodeyar was a very modern guy. He even electrified his palace in an astounding manner, as I just said. He was enthusiastic about both religion and physical culture. He was resistant to the British, and he stayed very powerful. At the time, he was one of the last Maharajas who really maintained power in the face of the British. He also was really interested in physical culture. He had ties with the YMCA, and actually, the Maharaja liked Krishnamacharya's physical yoga so much he would have Krishnamacharya and his students give demonstrations of their yogic practices at the palace. And in several occasions, he actually had members of the YMCA, which we talked about was big in India, observe these demonstrations, and he posited to them, this is what we should be doing all over India in the YMCA, because it's indigenous, it's our thing, as we'll talk about. It's completely our thing, and it doesn't need equipment, and this can be a system that we put all over India to encourage physical education. Okay. So the thing about the Maharaja is he had inspired a sort of culture of physical culture and experimentation at his court. So he would have gymnasts, and he would have sports people, and he would have all sorts of people around doing things that were very physical and cultivating the body. So around his palace were people experimenting with physical culture. And remember, I keep saying that yoga is the history of experimentations on the body to bring about health or liberation or magical powers. So what's a Maharaja? Well, Maharaja just means great king. They are regional kings, and the British were doing their best to consolidate their rule at the time. But some Maharajas maintained their power and their kingship into the 20th century, though none of them remain in power now. Okay, Iyengar was brought to BKS Iyengar argues that Krishnamacharya was brought down there to teach Sanskrit classes, and he was teaching on Mimamsa, which is philosophy through the Veda scripture, but the students complained that they were too difficult. So in fact, he was transferred to the yoga project because his Sanskrit teaching was considered too difficult. That sounds kind of goofy to me. I don't think he was a very good Sanskrit teacher. That could be the case. Who knows? I can't tell for sure. But the thing is due to the Maharaja patronizing Krishnamacharya specifically and yoga for health in general, Mysore as a town is still known as a place to study yoga, and there are myriad teachers and students there. I lived in Mysore for a couple of months one time, and I spent a lot of time with yoga people. That was a little weird. I was a Sanskrit guy, and they were yoga people. They were an intriguing lot. And the Ashtanga yoga people were always known as being the most rigorous, but almost fundamentalist about yoga. I knew a bunch of Ashtanga yoga people in Santa Barbara, and I would joke with them. I'd be like, you guys are like Ashtanga yoga fundamentalists. And they'd be like, yeah, we kind of are. And then oddly, they all smoked cigarettes. Oh, well, who's to say? Okay, so Krishnamacharya opened up his yoga shala, which means a yoga hut or a yoga hall. And at the time, there were a lot of Western sports, military exercise, and gymnastics at the court. And the participants in these sort of activities were the royal guards and the royal family. In fact, there are very few non-royal people, non-people related to the royal family or working for the royal family that got access to this sort of physical culture there. The early classes were described not as yoga, but they were described as a physical culture thing. They were viewed as exercise before they were really even called something called yoga. Intriguingly, the emphasis on the physical aspects of yoga may have been dictated by the Maharaja's passion for physical culture, which, if it became a big deal, would ensure further funding of the Yogashala. What do I mean to say by this? I mean, Krishnamacharya is inventing a new tradition of how to perform yoga. It's very physically impressive to look at and physically strenuous. At the same time, the Maharaja, who was paying the bills, was interested in developing physical cultures. So possibly Krishnamacharya emphasized the physicality of yoga as a way to appeal to the Maharaja and continue to have patronage by the royal court. So one of the arguments that we see that a lot of these Ashtanga Vinyasa people say is that yoga, as opposed to bodybuilding, builds health and well-being, not just big muscles. So in the area, and at the time, physical culture was big in Mysore, and many youths were interested in bodybuilding. And what was a slow start, Krishnamacharya gradually got really impressive physical specimens, by which I mean his students became really impressive, to the point that people would look at them and say, I want to be like these guys. I don't want to look like Eugene Sandow. I want to look like these guys. So, as we'll see, his yoga was viewed as an alternative to Western body cultures like bodybuilding. While it was new, as we shall see, it cloaked itself in tradition. So Krishnamacharya was always saying, oh, I learned this from this yogi who taught it to me, and it's 5,000 years old and whatever. So as we see now, his yoga was new, but it cloaked itself in tradition, but not the tradition of those nasty hatha yogis. He posited a tradition that never actually existed. He posited an ideal of people doing the type of yoga he was doing since time immemorial, when in fact, the yoga that people had been doing since the 14 and 1500s, who were hatha yogis, these guys he was not interested in at all, because there's that continual rejection of the hatha yogi as a figure and a reconception of the yogi as the healthy bodied person who thinks positively and is well balanced, as opposed to the hatha yogi who does yoga, practices meditation, and seeks liberation and renunciation from the world. All right. So at this time, in the 1930s, we see that Krishnamacharya started to use the so-called Surya Namaskara, the sun salutation, which we remember was created by a guy named Iyer, who was a bodybuilder, and he actually created it in probably the early 20th century, late 19th century, as a system of postures for bodybuilders to do that, and it wasn't just to appeal to everyone. But so what Krishnamacharya does, he takes the Surya Namaskara, which you see listed here, Surya Namaskara, and that's a position I used to do this all the time, but I don't do it very often anymore. Anyway, so what he did was he looked at the Surya Namaskara and then had people perform the Surya Namaskara, and then he would steadily add more and more steps to the Surya Namaskara. So if you look at the thing above, you can actually see all of the positions used in a traditional Krishnamacharya Ashtanga Vinyasa course and class, and it's all built on the movements of the Surya Namaskara. So they just get more and more complicated as you progress. Now, Krishnamacharya, as much as he said his yoga positions he learned completely from Ram Mohan Brahmachari, in fact, his body positions and asanas were always evolving. He claimed that it was all rooted in this mysterious and unknown text called the Yoga Karunta, but nobody had ever seen it, nobody ever has. And in fact, a lot of people from this time who are alive remember him making up body positions and changing body positions on the fly. So he would just be in class and he would dream up new yoga positions. So again, we see yoga as this thing that occurs in a context of experimentation on the body and with the body. In the late 1950s, Krishnamacharya was invited to take over yoga classes at the Vivekananda College in Madras, so what is now Chennai, and he would stay there until his death in the 1980s. Even after he left, Mysore yoga was a big thing. It was continued to be practiced, and it was associated with Krishnamacharya, and it continued to evolve through constant experimentation. In fact, Pattabhi Jois continued in Mysore, and there he started really codifying the sequences and the positions. So Krishnamacharya would give people different body positions based on the aptitude of the student or the constitution of the student. But Pattabhi Jois, when he started teaching really young, when he was like 18, was like, no, we're just going to do these positions. So he made it very specific. Okay, so he would do these sequences, Pattabhi Jois would, in unchanging orders with a counted drill for time. So you would get into one position, hold it for between 5 and 8 sentences, and then seconds, and then jump forward or jump back into another body position. Okay, so this is what we see in Ashtanga yoga classes today. At the time, the people of Mysore called it jumping yoga because it was jumping back and forth between the different body positions. Now, many of the details in this biography are a little dubious, and I will have some challenges to them in the next lecture. But for now, Krishnamacharya, father of modern postural yoga. So what's going on here? So this yoga is impressive, and unlike the contortion shows in which contortionists would dazzle the audience with weird body positions, here these yoga positions were performed in a set sequence. It was fun to do, and it was fun to watch. And watching them in synchronicity, watching 20 people do the exact same moves at the same time for the same amount of time was exciting and was interesting, and it was impressive. So remember that there were no sequences of yoga detailed before this time. Specific positions were done by yogis for specific ends, and they were held for quite some time, all thought to encourage meditation. Here we first see yoga routines that folks could observe and come to practice. Now, the Maharaja had regular demonstrations of yoga, aiming to promote yoga and physical culture that was indigenous to India, that was from India in the first place. It wasn't from outsiders. Iyengar, around this time, was in Mysore, and he recounts that he would regularly perform, and for the Maharaja, he would perform new sequences and complicated things they were doing. And he argued, in fact, Iyengar argues that a lot of the innovative and really rigorous and really difficult asanas, these body positions like you see here with this guy with his feet on the top of his head, these really came at this time because they had to keep dazzling the Maharaja. The Maharaja had to keep seeing these guys doing this incredible yoga and thinking, oh, yeah, I got to share that. Yeah, this is great. He'd be like, I got to keep paying these guys. So showing off and doing yoga demonstrations had a practical end of continuing patronage. Now, early in his career, we find that Krishnamacharya would do stuff like change his heartbeat or stop a car with his hands or lift big weights by his teeth, to the point that people describe his early classes on yoga and demonstrations as being like a circus event. So this is the old yoga strongman routine. So folk would, and Krishnamacharya's idea was, folk would be encouraged to do yoga if they saw these sort of these feats of awesomeness that he was going to do. One local strongman at the palace was so impressed with the yoga students that he endorsed Krishnamacharya's yoga over his bodybuilding and gymnastics routines. All this is to note that yoga was exercise here. It had no connection to spirituality. Now, in the 1930s, the Maharaja Wodeyar sent Krishnamacharya to do yoga demonstrations and promote yoga throughout India. One person says he was somehow able to lecture fluently in Hindi. I sincerely doubt it. I bet he spoke Kannada and Tamil. He did not speak Hindi. Okay, so by traveling around in the 1930s, it gave him a pan-Indian presence. And in later life, he began to be seen as a darn saint by his students. But again, he was just wandering around teaching pure exercise. As he traveled, he did observe other asanas in the north, especially, and when he would see new positions, he would incorporate them into his system. So who was he religiously? He was involved in Brahminical practices, probably mantra, philosophical speculation, and whatnot about devotion to the god Krishna. There's no discussion of gods in anything he does. For him, religion was something that he did. He didn't want his students to become religious like him. He wanted them to become physical like he was. So Pattabhi Jois actually recounts that some of the yoga asanas that were used in performances, they would be studied by the various students, and that there was a sequence of basic, intermediate, and advanced positions. These correspond almost exactly to the 3 classes of practice that Jois teaches today, or that is taught in Jois's tradition today. So the asanas are done in a sequence based on the Surya Namaskara. Each one is held for 5 to 8 seconds and done in perfect synchrony as a group. Nobody had ever seen this before. And group yoga, like in a yoga class, was born. His early writing suggests holding poses for long periods, but this sequence of yoga, the sequences of yoga, become the main way that this vinyasa ashtanga was practiced today. Arguably, the sequences arose out of these demonstrations, and they had to be impressive because they were basically marketing themselves. They were marketing their yoga product, their yoga technology, not only to the Maharaja Wodeyar, who was paying their bills, but also to everyone else was around trying to sell this fitness product. So yoga and education. Western style gymnastics and calisthenics, as we've seen, were common in Indian schools in the early 20th century, but equipment was really hard to come by. So lots of people were trying to figure out a solution for physical education, and Krishnamacharya figured it out with his physical yoga. In this way, the Western influence of like Ling gymnastics and movement cures and Desaltra, all these things were part of like the stew that was going on in India. They were part of the curry. And then Krishnamacharya came in and said, well, out of that curry, in this curry, I will make the most glorious new yoga thing. So Western body culture influenced India, creating a place where people were experimenting with their bodies to bring about physical perfection, health, and well-being. Out of that context, which is arguably very Western in its thoughts about health and exercise, Krishnamacharya put in the body positions in a sequence and had them practice for exercise in a Western manner. He effectively invented a new tradition. Western influence set the stage for Krishnamacharya's system to develop. So, Singleton writes, his system can be fruitfully considered a synthetic revival of indigenous exercises, so the yoga asanas that were practiced since the 1500s in India, within the context of Western curricular physical education in late colonial India. So this does a lot of work. He's creating a synthetic revival of asana practice within a Western physical education context with a notion of health as dictated out of Western body cultures. So he drew upon the long-standing gymnastics programs that were at place at the Maharaja's palace, but he moved away from using any equipment. There was, in fact, in the early 20th century, there was a push for more intense physical gymnastics in Europe than what was found in Ling. In particular, there was a form called primary or primitive gymnastics that was thought to build greater strength and vigor than regular gymnastics. This was pioneered by a guy named Niels Buch, who was a Danish guy, and he wrote a book called Primitive Gymnastics. In primitive gymnastics, this Scandinavian Danish gymnastics, we see at least 28 positions that are identical to positions found in Ashtanga yoga. So Buch's system also involved doing complicated strength. He also advocated doing complicated strength building positions in a sequence and jumping into each position. This sounds a lot like Ashtanga Vinyasa. So in the 1930s, there was an Indian character named Kavalyananda, who we talked about a little bit before. He was working to develop yoga exercise that would bring about health. And Krishnamacharya visited him in the 1930s, where he was in Mumbai, and he saw people doing yogic positions in a group, and Kuvalyananda drilling people, say, do this position, do this position, do this position. So Krishnamacharya borrowed this system of calling out the name of a position and then guiding the students through subsequent linked positions, which is exactly what we see all over yoga classes today. So throughout India, we do see that other people than Krishnamacharya were using asanas, and they were used in physical culture as a sort of gymnastic bricolage. Bricolage means like a crazy quilt. Bricolage is when you take a whole bunch of broken pots and you put the pot sherds together to make a picture. So out of one thing becomes something new, or out of broken thing comes something new. Okay, so what? I mean, this is all about modernity and tradition, something I've been thinking about a lot lately. So claims at the root, hold on, sorry. So when you have these sorts of claims that what someone is doing is found in primordial history, that they're ancient, or that they were only learned through a mystic vision of a guru, or they use texts that can't be found, these are all common rhetorical strategies in Indic tradition. They're more of a thing of myth than a thing of historical reality. And when I say myth, I mean a story or a concept that structures life. Myth is not false. It's just different from historically accurate sets of events. Myth makes sense of things. So in many ways, the story of Krishnamacharya studying with this guru, finding this crazy book, all of that are just common ways to build authority on what he was teaching. I mean, we can concretely show that Krishnamacharya was inventing something new out of the tradition of hatha and body positions, Western physical culture, and the unique requirements of his Mysore position. Namely, he needed to wow that Maharaja, so he kept getting money. It was a good system. And in fact, his disciples would spread it all over the world. But we should note that until recently, the vast majority of the people performing Ashtanga yoga were all Westerners, meaning that this new tradition that Krishnamacharya formed to be derived from and for indigenous India changed its audience to be an audience of Westerners and travelers. Okay, so I think there's this great quote that by Jean Filiozat, who's a great French Indologist, that is translated by Singleton here, and I wanted to read it to you. The Orthodox pundit, the Orthodox teacher of Sanskrit stuff, the Orthodox pundit is not in the least concerned to restore an ancient state of affairs. If he were to point out the diachronic differences, which means the historical differences, between the base text, Sanskrit text he's reading, and his own epoch, he would have to reveal his own share of innovation and his individuality. He prefers to keep this later hidden. For him, the important thing is to present the whole of his knowledge, which contains both the ancient heritage and its new visions, as an organized totality. This means that anytime a Hindu guru or a pundit is speaking and is really being like, this is my interpretation based on this time, he's always going to say, as the great sages did in the forest long years ago. Why? It doesn't have to be true, but you have to assert that because it makes it more valuable. It makes it true. So why am I ending here? Because tradition is conceived differently everywhere, and so is authority. Something only needs to be handed down once. Remember this always. Something only needs to be handed down once to become a tradition. So making claims that whatever you are presenting is timeless, continuous with the ancient scriptures like the Vedas, or that any innovations that are presented are just recoveries of ancient lore that was lost. This is very common in Indic culture. And we must think about our own culture in which new interpretations are given authority by the old. Think about, Christianity and the way Protestants are always talking about how what they are doing in their contemporary church is doing what they did in the early Christian church, when they don't look alike at all. But people make that argument. We're practicing in the old ways. Or you think about arguments about the US Constitution. People will say that, you can make this new reading of the Constitution, but they argue that because they're basing it on the Constitution, these novel readings are essentially the same thing that the founding fathers would have made. Or what about the Pledge of Allegiance? That hasn't been going on forever. That's really only been going on since like the 60s. And they've changed the words a bunch of times. How about turkey at Thanksgiving? What about birthday parties? People didn't used to celebrate birthday parties. That's a 20th century thing. So often the things we think are quite old, once we historicize them, are much more recent. Does that make them less powerful? Absolutely not. Is it interesting to look at the histories of ideas and how things change? Absolutely. The thing to remember is that the rhetoric is to make a thing that is innovative or situated in a specific context and make it timeless. Timelessness means authority. Timelessness means authenticity. How can something that is unchanging ever be false? For it is unchanging. So just remember, when somebody argues for something being timeless, and that because it's timeless, it's authentic, be careful what they're selling. I'll talk to you later.